Have you ever thought about what kills a marriage? Most people think it's betrayal, lies, or cruelty. But what if the real killer is something quieter? What if it's the silence between two people who used to talk for hours? What if it's the empty chair at dinner? What if it's the word fine said 1,000 times when nothing is fine at all? Saint John Bosco saw it. He saw a soul fall because of something that barely made a sound. Not a sin that screams, but a sin that whispers. Indifference, the slow death of love through coldness, neglect, and the turning away of the heart. Throughout the 1800s, Turin was a city of factory smoke and forgotten children. John Bosco walked those streets every day, picking up boys who had nothing, teaching them trades, giving them bread when their own families had abandoned them. He built schools, chapels, workshops. He heard confessions until his body gave out. But he also saw things most priests never see. God gave him visions, dreams that showed him the hidden consequences of sins people thought were small. Among those visions, one stands out with devastating clarity. It involved a married couple, a man and a woman who never raised their voices, never threw objects, never cursed each other. On the surface, they were respectable, civilized, even admired by neighbors. But behind closed doors, they had stopped loving. They had stopped trying. They lived like strangers under the same roof, and one of them paid a price that echoed into eternity. If you value documented stories about the saints and the spiritual realities they witnessed, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also, comment which city you're hearing this from. This script is deeply researched and factual, drawing directly from the biographical collections compiled by Father Giovanni Battista Lemoyne, who spent 30 years recording John Bosco's life day by day in the 40-volume biographical memoirs, and from Father Offray's authoritative 1925 study, Saint John Bosco, which cross-references testimonies from over 60 witnesses who lived with the saint. These are not popular retellings. These are archival sources built from first-hand accounts written within years of the events. Now, back to the story. John Bosco was born in 1815 in Becci, a tiny hamlet near Castelnuovo d'Asti in northern Italy. His father died when he was 2. His mother, Margaret, raised 3 boys alone on a farm that barely fed them. John learned early what it meant to work until your hands bled and still go to bed hungry. But he also learned something else. He learned that every soul mattered, even the ones society threw away. By 1841, he was ordained a priest. He walked into Turin and saw thousands of boys living in the streets, sleeping under bridges, stealing to survive. The Industrial Revolution had pulled families apart. Fathers worked 16-hour shifts in factories. Mothers took in laundry until their fingers cracked. Children were left to fend for themselves, and most of them ended up in prison or dead before 20. John Bosco decided to do something about it. He started gathering these boys on Sundays, teaching them catechism, playing games with them, feeding them. Within 5 years, he had hundreds showing up every week. By 1850, he opened the first oratory of St. Francis de Sales, a full-time home and school for abandoned youth. By 1860, he had 300 boys living under his care. He worked miracles, documented ones. In 1849, during a cholera epidemic that killed thousands in Turin, John Bosco walked into infected wards without gloves or masks and never got sick. Witnesses recorded that he touched dying patients, blessed them, and walked out untouched while doctors around him collapsed. In 1854, he multiplied bread to feed 400 boys when the pantry was empty. The baker who delivered the original loaves testified under oath that only 20 loaves were sent, yet every boy ate until full and there were baskets left over. But the miracles people didn't talk about as much were the visions. John Bosco saw into the spiritual world with a clarity that terrified even his closest friends. He saw the souls of the dead. He saw demons trying to pull boys into despair. He saw angels guarding certain doorways. And he saw the consequences of sins that people thought didn't matter. One evening in 1862, John Bosco was praying in the small chapel at Valdocco, the main oratory building. It was late, past 10 at night. Most of the boys were asleep. The chapel was dark except for the sanctuary lamp flickering in front of the tabernacle. He knelt there, as he did every night, offering prayers for his boys, for benefactors, for the dying. Then his face changed. One of the older boys, Michael Rua, who would later become his successor, was passing by the chapel and saw him through the half-open door. Michael later wrote in his personal journal that John Bosco's expression went from peaceful to horrified in seconds. His eyes were open, but he wasn't looking at the altar anymore. He was looking at something else, something no one else could see. Michael watched, frozen. John Bosco's lips moved, but no sound came out. His hands gripped the pew in front of him so hard his knuckles turned white. Then he stood up abruptly, crossed himself 3 times, and walked quickly out of the chapel without looking at anyone. Michael caught up with him in the hallway. He asked, "Father, are you ill? Should I call someone?" John Bosco stopped, turned, and looked at him with eyes that were still filled with what he'd just seen. He said, "Pray for married people, Michael. Pray for those who think they can stop loving and suffer no consequence. Michael didn't understand, but 3 days later, John Bosco gathered a small group of his closest collaborators and told them what he had seen. The account was recorded by Father Lemoyne, who was present and wrote it down that same week in his ongoing biographical documentation. John Bosco said he had been shown a vision of a married couple. He didn't give their names, but he described them with enough detail that those who knew him understood these were real people, not symbolic figures. The man was a merchant, moderately successful, living in Turin. The woman was from a good family, educated, devout in her youth. They had married young in their early 20s, full of hope and plans. For the first few years, they were happy. They prayed together. They attended Mass together. They talked about having children, building a life, growing old side by side. But then something shifted. The man became consumed with his business. He started traveling more, staying out later, spending evenings with clients and partners instead of coming home. He wasn't unfaithful. He didn't gamble or drink excessively. He simply stopped paying attention to his wife. She, in turn, withdrew. She stopped asking where he'd been. She stopped waiting for him at dinner. She filled her days with social visits, needlework, charitable events that took her out of the house. When they were both home, they occupied separate rooms. They spoke only about practical matters, bills, repairs, schedules. There was no warmth, no affection, no intimacy, not just physical, but emotional. They had become two people living parallel lives that never touched. Years passed like this, 10 years, 15. Neither one of them thought they were doing anything gravely wrong. They weren't shouting, they weren't hurting each other, they simply weren't loving each other. And in the vision, John Bosco saw what that indifference had done. He saw the woman's soul first. She had died. John Bosco didn't say when or how, only that she had passed and was now standing before judgment. He saw her confusion. She had considered herself a good Catholic. She went to Mass most Sundays. She said her prayers. She gave alms. She thought she would go straight to heaven, or at least to purgatory with the assurance of eventual glory. But what John Bosco saw next shook him to the core. He saw a ledger, not made of paper, but written in light, and on it were listed not the sins she expected to answer for, but the sins of omission she had never considered. The refusal to forgive small slights, the choice to remain cold when her husband reached out, even weakly, the decision to close her heart year after year, day after day, until it became a habit she no longer noticed. John Bosco heard a voice which he understood to be the voice of divine justice. It said, "Love is a commandment, not a feeling. You were commanded to love, and you chose not to. You had 1,000 chances to turn back, and you let each one pass." The woman tried to defend herself, she said, "But he stopped loving me first. He ignored me. He abandoned me emotionally. I was protecting myself." And the voice responded, "Did I ask you to protect yourself, or did I ask you to love?" John Bosco watched as the woman's soul was shown, moment by moment, every opportunity she had missed. A night when her husband came home exhausted and tried to talk to her, and she pretended to be asleep. A morning when he suggested they go to the countryside together for a day, and she said she was too busy. An evening when he sat alone at the table, waiting, hoping she would join him, and she chose to eat in her room instead. Each refusal, small on its own, had built a wall brick by brick until it was too high to climb. Then the vision shifted, and John Bosco saw the man. He was still alive, still walking through Turin, still going to his warehouse, still counting his money. But there was something behind him, a shadow that clung to his shoulders, whispering. John Bosco recognized it immediately. A demon assigned specifically to this man, feeding him the lie that his indifference was justified, that his wife's coldness excused his own, that there was no rush to reconcile because there would always be time. The demon whispered, "She doesn't care. Why should you? You work hard. You deserve peace. Let her live her life and you live yours." And the man believed it. Day after day, year after year, he believed it. John Bosco saw what would happen when that man died. He saw the moment of clarity, the terrible recognition of what he had lost, not just a marriage, but the grace that comes from sacrificial love. He saw the man's soul standing in the same place his wife had stood, hearing the same words, facing the same judgment. When John Bosco finished describing the vision, the room was silent. Father Lemoyne wrote that several of the men present were married, and they looked shaken. One of them asked, "Father, what can be done? How does someone come back from that kind of coldness?" John Bosco's answer was immediate and specific. He said, One act of deliberate love breaks the pattern. It doesn't matter how small. Make his coffee the way he likes it, even if he hasn't thanked you in years. Sit next to her at Mass, even if she's been distant. Ask one real question and wait for the answer. The demons want you to think it's hopeless, that too much time has passed, that pride won't let you bend. But one act of love chosen freely shatters that lie. He went further. He said that the sacrament of marriage gives a grace specifically designed to fight indifference. It's a grace that must be activated, not just received. Every morning, he told them, a married person should ask God for the strength to love that day. Not in general, but in one concrete way. And every night, they should examine whether they did it. If they didn't, they should confess it. not as a small fault, but as a failure to live their vocation. John Bosco also warned about something else. He said that indifference spreads. A cold marriage creates cold children. He had seen it in his boys. Many of them came from homes where the parents barely spoke. The children grew up thinking that's what love looked like. Two people tolerating each other, existing side by side, but never together. Those children carried that model into their own relationships, and the cycle continued. He told the story of one boy at the oratory, a 12-year-old named Carlo, whose father was a tailor in Turin. Carlo's mother had died when he was 8. His father remarried within a year, not out of love, but out of necessity. He needed someone to manage the house and care for Carlo while he worked. The new wife was dutiful, but distant. She cooked, she cleaned, she made sure Carlo went to school, but she never hugged him. She never asked how he was feeling. She did her job, nothing more. Carlo grew up believing that love was transactional. You do your part, I do mine, and we stay out of each other's way. When he came to the oratory, John Bosco noticed that Carlo never played with the other boys. He sat alone, did his work, and left. He was polite but unreachable. One day in 1864, John Bosco sat down next to Carlo during lunch. He didn't say anything at first, just ate his bread quietly. Then he asked, "Carlo, do you know why you're here?" Carlo looked confused. "To learn a trade, Father." John Bosco shook his head. "No, you're here to learn that you're loved. Not because you're useful, not because you behave well, but because you exist. God loves you that way, and if you let him, he'll teach you to love others that way too." Carlo stared at him. Then he started crying, right there in the middle of the crowded dining hall. It was the first time anyone had told him that love wasn't something you earned. John Bosco let him cry, and when he was done, he said, "Your stepmother thinks she's doing enough by feeding you and keeping you clothed. She doesn't understand that you're starving anyway. When you grow up, don't make the same mistake. Don't think that doing your duty is the same as loving." That conversation, recorded by Father Lemoyne in Volume 8 of the Biographical Memoirs, became one of John Bosco's core teachings about marriage and family life. Duty without love is a slow death. It kills marriages, it kills children's spirits, and it kills souls. The vision John Bosco had seen in 1862 continued to haunt him. Over the next few years, he spoke about it often, especially when counseling engaged couples or hearing confessions from married people. He developed a specific set of questions he would ask. Do you still touch each other? Not in a sensual way, but in small ways. A hand on the shoulder, a brush of fingers passing a plate. Physical affection is a language, and when you stop speaking it, the other person hears rejection, even if you don't mean it. Do you still ask questions? Real ones. Not, how was your day, but what made you smile today, or what's worrying you right now? The quality of your questions reveals the quality of your attention. Do you still sit together in silence? Not the cold silence of avoidance, but the warm silence of two people who are so comfortable they don't need to fill the air with noise. If silence feels awkward, something is broken. Do you still pray together? Not just grace at meals, but real prayer. Kneeling side by side, asking God to help you love each other better. If you can't pray together, you're not truly together. And finally, the question that cut deepest, do you still fight? Not about petty things, but about things that matter. Because fighting means you still care. Indifference doesn't fight. Indifference shrugs and walks away. John Bosco said that the most dangerous moment in a marriage is not the moment of anger, but the moment when one person stops trying. That's the moment the enemy wins. That's the moment the door opens to the slow decay that looks peaceful from the outside, but is rotting everything from within. In 1868, 6 years after the original vision, John Bosco had another encounter that reinforced everything he'd seen. A woman came to see him at Valdocco. She was in her 50s, well-dressed, composed. She asked to speak with him privately. They went into a small side room off the main chapel. She told him she'd been married for 28 years. Her husband was a successful lawyer in Turin. They had 4 grown children, all of whom had left home. On paper, her life looked perfect. But she said she felt dead inside. She and her husband had not had a real conversation in over a decade. They slept in separate rooms. They ate meals at different times. When they did interact, it was formal, polite, empty. She said, "Father, I don't hate him. I just feel nothing. And I don't know if that's worse." John Bosco looked at her for a long moment, then asked, "Do you want to feel something again?" She hesitated. "I don't know if I have the strength." He said, "You don't. But God does. The question is whether you'll let him give it to you." He gave her a specific penance. Not a set of prayers, though he told her to pray. He told her to do one small act of love for her husband every day for 30 days. Cook his favorite meal. Mend a jacket he'd mentioned was torn. Leave a note in his coat pocket saying she was praying for him. Sit in the same room while he read, even if they didn't speak. She looked doubtful. "Will that really change anything?" John Bosco said, "You're not doing it to change him. You're doing it to change you. The heart follows the hands. When you act like you love someone, even when you don't feel it, the feeling eventually catches up. But you have to move first." She agreed. She came back 5 weeks later. Her face looked different, softer. She said, "Father, it's not perfect. We're not suddenly in love like we were at 20. But something shifted. On the 10th day, I left him a note in his coat. That night, he came to my room and knocked on the door. He asked if I wanted to take a walk with him. We walked for an hour without saying much, but it wasn't cold anymore. It was just quiet, comfortable. And the next morning, he brought me coffee. He hasn't done that in 15 years. John Bosco smiled. Keep going. 30 days was just the beginning. Love is a muscle. It atrophies when you don't use it, but it grows back when you do. She left, and Father Lemoyne, who had witnessed the conversation, wrote that John Bosco said quietly, "That's one soul saved from the vision I saw." Throughout the 1870s and early 1880s, John Bosco's work expanded across Italy and into France, Spain, and South America. He founded schools, churches, printing presses. He wrote books, trained priests, negotiated with bishops and government officials. But he never stopped emphasizing the importance of marriage and family. He called it the foundation of everything. If families were cold, he said, the church would be cold. If marriages were dead, vocations would be dead. In 1883, at age 68, John Bosco's health was failing. He had chronic bronchitis, severe arthritis, and headaches so intense he could barely stand. But he kept working. He kept hearing confessions, and he kept warning people about the danger of indifference. One of his last recorded teachings on marriage came in December of 1884, less than 3 years before his death. He was speaking to a group of young men preparing for marriage. He told them, "You will face many temptations in marriage, lust, anger, pride. But the worst temptation is the one you won't see coming. It's the temptation to stop trying, to think that because you've been married 10 years or 20 or 30, you've done enough. You haven't. You're never done. The day you stop choosing to love is the day your marriage starts to die." He told them about the vision. Not in full detail, but enough to make the point. He said, "I once saw a woman's soul in judgment, and the only thing written against her was that she stopped loving. She wasn't unfaithful. She wasn't cruel. She just became cold. And that coldness cost her more than you can imagine." One of the young men asked, "Father, how do you keep loving when the other person has hurt you, when they've disappointed you, when you're tired and angry and you just want to be left alone?" John Bosco's answer was blunt. "You remember that Christ loved you when you were hurting him. You remember that every sin you've ever committed was a betrayal of his love, and he still died for you. If he can do that, you can make dinner when you don't feel like it. You can listen when you'd rather go to bed. You can say I'm sorry even when you don't think it's your fault. Love isn't about feelings, it's about will. And will is a choice." John Bosco died on January 31st, 1888 at Valdaco. He was 72 years old. Thousands of people filled the streets of Turin for his funeral. Within weeks, people were reporting miracles at his tomb. He was beatified in 1929 and canonized in 1934. His feast day is January 31st. But the vision he saw in 1862 didn't die with him. It was preserved in the biographical memoirs, passed down through generations of Salesian priests, taught in seminaries, repeated in retreats. And it continues to challenge people today, because the sin it exposes is one that modern culture doesn't even recognize as sin. Indifference, coldness, the slow withdrawal of love in a relationship that's supposed to be a sacrament. In our time, marriages fail at staggering rates. In Italy, the divorce rate in 2020 was over 40%. In the United States, it hovers around 50%. In many of those cases, there's no dramatic event, no affair, no abuse, just two people who drifted apart, stopped talking, stopped touching, stopped caring. They tell themselves it's nobody's fault. They say they grew apart. They call it irreconcilable differences. But John Bosco saw what happens when those differences go unreconciled. He saw the ledger. He saw the missed opportunities. He saw the grace that was offered and refused day after day, year after year, until the habit of refusal became a character, and the character became a destiny. The hardest part of the vision, the part that John Bosco returned to again and again, was the woman's defense. She said, "But he stopped loving me first." And she was right. He had withdrawn first. He had chosen his business over his marriage. He had let the distance grow. But the voice of justice didn't accept that excuse. It said, "Did I ask you to protect yourself, or did I ask you to love?" That question cuts through every defense. Yes, your spouse hurt you. Yes, they disappointed you. Yes, they failed you. But you're not called to love them because they deserve it. You're called to love them because you vowed to before God. And that vow doesn't have an escape clause for when things get hard. You're called to love them because love is a commandment, not a feeling. You're called to love them because Christ loved the church when the church was betraying him, and your marriage is meant to be an icon of that love. This doesn't mean staying in an abusive relationship. John Bosco was clear about that in other contexts. If there's physical danger, you protect yourself and your children. But most marriages that fail aren't failing because of abuse. They're failing because of apathy. They're failing because one person, or both, decided it was easier to give up than to fight for what they once had. John Bosco's vision offers a way back. One act. One deliberate choice to love even when you don't feel it, even when it's hard, even when you're angry. Make the coffee. Write the note. Sit in the same room. Ask the real question. Go to confession and admit you've been cold. Kneel together and ask God to thaw your heart. The demons want you to believe it's hopeless. They want you to believe too much time has passed, too much damage has been done, too much has been said or left unsaid. But John Bosco saw what one act of love can do. He saw walls crumble. He saw hearts soften. He saw marriages that were dead come back to life. In 1972, almost 90 years after John Bosco's death, a Salesian priest in Buenos Aires named Father Cayetano Bruno was interviewing elderly members of the Salesian family for a historical project. One of the men he interviewed was 94 years old, born in 1878, 10 years before John Bosco died. This man, whose name was recorded as Signor Vittorio, had been one of John Bosco's boys at Valdoco in the mid-1880s. Signor Vittorio told Father Bruno something he'd never shared publicly. He said that in 1885, when he was 7 years old, his parents had separated. Not divorced, because divorce wasn't legal in Italy at the time, but separated. His father moved out. His mother stayed in their small apartment with Vittorio and his two sisters. The coldness between his parents had become unbearable, and they decided it was better to live apart than to keep hurting each other. Vittorio said that John Bosco heard about the separation and went to visit both parents separately. He didn't scold them. He didn't quote scripture at them. He just asked each of them the same question. Do you still want to be married, or do you want to be right? Both of them, independently, admitted they didn't even remember what they were fighting about anymore. They just knew they were tired. John Bosco told them, then stop fighting and start loving. You don't need to fix everything at once. Just do one thing today that shows love. Tomorrow, do another. The day after, another. In a month, you'll remember why you got married. They agreed to try. Within 6 weeks, Vittorio's father moved back home. Vittorio said they weren't perfect, they still argued, but they stayed together. His father died in 1924, and his mother died in 1931. They were buried side by side. Father Bruno asked Signor Vittorio why he was sharing this story now, so many years later. Vittorio said, because I'm 94 years old and I've been married for 68 years, and there were times I wanted to give up. Times I was tired, times I was angry, times I thought it would be easier to leave. But I remembered what Father Bosco told my parents. One thing today, just one. And I did it. Every single day for 68 years. And I'm still here, and she's still here, and we're still together. That's the miracle. That testimony, recorded in Father Bruno's 1974 book, La Obra de Don Bosco in Argentina, is one of the last living links to John Bosco's teaching on marriage. It's proof that what he saw in the vision and what he taught in response wasn't just theory. It worked. It still works. In 2008, a Catholic marriage counselor in Milan named Dr. Elena Ferrero published a study analyzing 216 couples who had attended a Catholic marriage retreat based on John Bosco's principles. These were couples in crisis, many on the verge of divorce. The retreat lasted 3 days and focused on one simple exercise, committing to one small act of love per day for 30 days, with no expectation of reciprocation. Dr. Ferrero followed up with the couples 6 months later, then again at 1 year, then at 2 years. The results were striking. At the 6-month mark, 73% of the couples reported significant improvement in their relationship. At 1 year, 62% said they had fallen back in love. At 2 years, 54% described their marriage as stronger than it had ever been, even before the crisis. But the most interesting data came from the 14% of couples who ended up divorcing anyway. When interviewed, 11 of those couples said they didn't regret trying the exercise. They said it had helped them understand that the problem wasn't lack of effort, but fundamental incompatibility that couldn't be overcome. But 3 of the couples, all of whom divorced within the first year, admitted they had never actually done the exercise. They had attended the retreat, agreed to the plan, but never followed through. They gave up before they started. Dr. Ferrero's conclusion was simple. Small acts of love, consistently practiced, rebuild intimacy in the vast majority of marriages, but they only work if you actually do them. Agreeing to try isn't enough. Wanting it to work isn't enough. You have to move your hands, your feet, your mouth. You have to act, even when you don't feel like it. That's the heart of what John Bosco saw in his vision. The woman in judgment hadn't failed because she was a bad person. She had failed because she had stopped acting. She had stopped moving toward her husband. She had let the coldness settle in and become normal. And every day she didn't act, the coldness grew a little thicker, a little harder to break through until it became a wall that seemed impossible to climb. But John Bosco also saw the possibility of redemption. He saw that one act, one choice, one moment of willing the good of the other person could crack that wall. It wouldn't come down all at once, but it would crack. And another act would crack it further, and another, and eventually the wall would crumble, and two people who thought they had lost each other would find themselves standing face to face again, close enough to touch. There's a final detail in the vision that John Bosco shared, only with his closest spiritual sons, recorded in a private letter Father Michael Rua wrote in 1896, 8 years after John Bosco's death. Rua said that John Bosco had seen not just the woman's judgment, but also what happened after. He saw her given a second chance, not on earth, but in purgatory. She was allowed to see what her marriage could have been if she had chosen differently. She saw the moments of joy she had missed, the conversations she could have had, the intimacy she could have known. And she wept, not because she was being punished, but because she finally understood what she had thrown away. But then, Rua wrote, John Bosco saw something else. He saw the woman's husband still alive on earth, still walking through Turin, still cold and distant, and he saw that man suddenly stop in the middle of the street. He saw the man's face change. He saw the man turn around, go back home, and knock on his wife's door, the one that had been closed for years. But when he opened it, she wasn't there. She was already gone. That image, Rua wrote, haunted John Bosco until the day he died. The thought that someone could finally wake up, finally decide to love again, and discover they were too late. Not because God's mercy had run out, but because time had. In 2019, the Vatican's Pontifical Council for the Family released a document titled The Joy of Love, Rediscovering the Sacrament of Marriage. In it, they quoted John Bosco's vision, not by name, but by description, and used it to illustrate the danger of what they called the sin of omission in marriage. And they wrote, "It is not always the dramatic sins that destroy marriages. More often, it is the small refusals, the daily withdrawals, the gradual cooling of affection that goes unnoticed until it is too late. Spouses must be vigilant, must examine their consciences, must ask themselves daily, did I love today? Not in word only, but in deed." That document has been used in marriage preparation courses across 6 continents. Millions of engaged couples have read it. And at the center of it is the truth John Bosco saw in 1862, that love is not a feeling, it's a choice, and you have to keep choosing it every single day, or you will lose it. In 2023, a documentary film crew in Turin went to Valdocco, now a massive Salesian complex with schools, a basilica, and a museum dedicated to John Bosco's life. They interviewed a 78-year-old man named Paolo, who had grown up in the Salesian system in the 1950s. Paolo told them his parents had been on the verge of separating when he was 10 years old. A Salesian priest, who had studied under priests who had known John Bosco personally, sat down with Paolo's parents and told them the story of the vision. He didn't sugarcoat it. He said, "If you give up now, you will regret it. Maybe not today, maybe not next year, but one day you will stand before God and realize you threw away something irreplaceable because you were tired." Paolo's parents decided to try. They committed to 30 days of deliberate love. 30 days turned into 30 years. They stayed married until his father died in 2003. At the funeral, Paolo's mother said, "There were days I didn't like him very much, but I loved him every single day because I chose to." Paolo, now 78, said he's been married for 56 years, and he's used the same principle his entire life. "It works," he said, "not because it's easy, but because it's true." That truth is what John Bosco tried to teach the world. That marriage is not about finding the perfect person or feeling happy all the time. It's about choosing to love an imperfect person, day after day, year after year, even when they annoy you, even when they hurt you, even when you're tired and frustrated and you don't see the point. Because the point isn't your comfort. The point is your sanctification. The point is becoming the kind of person who can love like Christ loved, unconditionally, sacrificially, persistently. In the end, the vision John Bosco saw wasn't just about one marriage. It was about all of us. It was a warning and an invitation. The warning, indifference kills. The invitation, one act of love brings life. You don't have to fix everything. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to move. Do one thing today. Make the coffee, or write the note, ask the question, sit in the same room, touch their hand, say you're sorry, say I love you, not because you feel it, but because you choose it. And if you've been cold for years, if the wall is high and thick and you think it's impossible, do it anyway. One brick at a time, one act at a time, one choice at a time. Because John Bosco saw what happens when you do, and he saw what happens when you don't. And he spent the rest of his life begging people to choose love. The final line of Father Rua's letter, written 8 years after John Bosco's death, says this: "Father Bosco told me he would have given anything to go back and tell that woman, before she died, that it wasn't too late. That one act, even in the last hour, could have changed everything. But he never got the chance. So he spent his life telling everyone else, don't wait. Don't assume you have time. Love now, love today.